You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist.
Hi everyone, it's Paige Smathers. Thanks so much for being here. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at positive-nutrition.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, whatever podcast app you use to listen to this podcast. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast, and thanks so much for joining me. This is a really important conversation I'm sharing with you this week, and I am just excited to share this. I'm excited to explore this idea of privilege with each of you, and I'm really excited to kind of dive into why this matters when we're talking about food, when we're talking about nutrition, when we're talking about medical care, when we're talking about social justice. All of these different elements kind of intersect in a lot of different ways, but in one important way with privilege. So today I'm bringing you a conversation I had with Nicole Mcdermid, who will introduce herself more as we get into the podcast. But for now, just thanks for being here, and I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for your attention in this really important conversation. So a couple things. If you're new to the podcast, I encourage you to consider joining our Nutrition Matters podcast community on Facebook. Even if you aren't new to the podcast, I still encourage you to join us there. That's where I will do a little bit more in-depth live videos and answer questions and kind of be a part of the discussion. Also, there's hundreds of people at this point there, and everybody is just supportive and kind of on a similar journey as you. So if you're someone who's kind of craving more community in your process of healing your relationship with food, consider joining us there. Just search Nutrition Matters Podcast Community on Facebook and it will come up, and then I will approve you as a member. Also, I want to just mention this podcast is, as I mentioned last week, I don't take sponsorships, but I kind of sponsor my own podcast, meaning, this podcast is made possible by the occasional sale of the courses and products that I offer. So I always like to make sure that you know kind of about those and that you have the ability to kind of check them out and you're aware of them. So this latest online course that I've released is called Positive Nutrition 101. This course is all about how to be more confident in your scientific knowledge about nutrition so that you're less kind of concerned or tempted to kind of go off into these fad diets. So this course is 12 lessons long, where we cover topics like how to be more research and media literate, the science of metabolism, micronutrients, macronutrients, meal planning, grocery shopping, exercise, normal eating, lots of different topics, gut health. So if you're interested, if that sounds like an interesting topic to you, or if you're kind of feeling like you're constantly confused about what the truth is about nutrition and really what we know and what we don't know, or how to more confidently navigate nutrition messages you hear on a daily basis, consider checking out the course. This course is available at positive-nutrition.com, and then just click on the Academy tab. It'll take you right there to the course, and you can check it out. As always, just feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about the course. I would love to help answer them. And we already have, quite a few people signed up, and I've heard great things so far, and I'm really, really proud of this course. So consider checking it out if it might be a good fit for where you are in your journey. Okay, so with that, I am so excited to bring you this podcast episode with Nicole Mcdermid, who is a recovery coach and social worker by trade in Australia. And she is super, super passionate about the social justice side of size and sizeism. And we talk about that today. We talk about privilege and why it matters in these conversations we have about nutrition and health and eating, and also even body positivity. So, as always, I'm so excited you're here. And this particular one, I'm really excited to kind of bring you a little bit of a different angle on talking about nutrition and eating. And I think it's a really important thing for each of us to look at in ourselves so that we're able to move this, process forward of really trying to shift the culture, make the world a safer, more productive place for people of all sizes. And I'm just grateful for Nicole's wisdom in this podcast. I know you'll love it. So thanks again for joining me. And here's Nicole. Nicole, welcome to Nutrition Matters Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I feel the same. It's been, I say this a lot on the podcast, but this one really has been a long time coming. And I dropped the ball last week when we were supposed to record. So I'm just glad we're finally doing it after all this time.
I know, it's so great to catch up. So great.
Yeah, so talk for a minute, Nicole, before we dive into our topic, just kind of introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners, talk about what you do sort of broadly with your work, and then we'll dive in.
Awesome. So my name's Nicole Mcdermid. I am a social worker by trade, and specialize in the field of eating disorders. I'm also an eating disorder recovery coach, and yeah, I guess I've got a pretty large, if I can say that, social media presence. I'm quite active on social media, and activism is a huge part of what I do out there in the world as well. So I've got a big presence in the fat activism space too. So not only am I doing a lot of clinical work with people, I'm also really, really active in the activist space too. So that's me.
So for someone who's new to the podcast or to this world, talk about what you would define fat activism to be.
Okay, it's a huge it's a huge topic.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I guess in a nutshell, my what I do in terms of what I do in my presence on social media, fat activism is going to look different for everybody. Essentially, it is political. It is about the visibility of fat bodies. It is about disrupting social norms in terms of what diet culture believes bodies should be, or I guess this idealized body type. It's about disrupting those norms, and the messaging that I put out there in terms of social media is about breaking down those systems of oppression that further marginalize fat bodies. And I guess all the messaging out there that we hear, day in, day out, fat has become synonymous with lazy, with unhealthy, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's basically about calling that out for me. It's about breaking down the idea that fat bodies are, somehow unworthy compared to other bodies. And it's about really, I guess, kind of sticking it to the status quo and saying, actually, no, like fat bodies are worthy bodies too. So that's a lot of my messaging. I don't tend to post a lot of photos of my body on social media. That's not my brand. That's not my market. But there are a lot of fat activists out there that do. And I love the fact that it's really just about, it's a political movement, and it's really about disrupting social norms. It's about choosing sides. It's about getting angry, and it's about speaking up and standing in your power and using your voice to, as I said, really disrupt the status quo.
Oh, I love it. It's so important. I want to make the point here, and I don't want it to feel like I'm making this about thin people, because I don't mean for it to come off that way. But if I have a thin listener who's wondering, okay, well, that's great for Nicole. What does this have to do with me? I just want to quickly answer that question. To me, this matters to all of us, because the fat phobia that we all are steeped in culturally affects everyone regardless of size. It is a problem that needs all of us to find solutions, and also it's a problem that affects all of us. So I think we have the tendency to be like, oh, they're talking about something that doesn't affect me, I just won't listen, or this doesn't have anything to do with me. And I just want to make the point, it very much does. And everybody's voice is needed, and everybody's gifts are needed to help move this forward, because everybody's life gets better when fat people are allowed to simply exist peacefully in our world. What else would you add to that, though?
Yeah, I think you summed that up beautifully. It really is, diet culture and fat phobia, it does, it affects everybody. And, one of the lines that I tend to use, all the time is that, you know, people in larger bodies tend to spend their lives trying to shrink themselves, and those in those in smaller bodies spend their lives being absolutely terrified of one day looking like me. And I think that's a perfect example about how fat phobia and diet culture absolutely affects everybody. And I think, it's a system of oppression. Fat phobia is absolutely a system of oppression, and it's up to all of us to be able to call that out when we see it. It's all of our responsibility to be a part of dismantling this social construct. And it's really about opening and having those conversations. I don't think it's up to, one particular person, a group of people in particular. It's all of our responsibility. And I think this is where the more we can have these conversations, the more open we can be to actually start to create a more inclusive and diverse world where we can celebrate all bodies.
Oh, I love that. I want that. That's like my vision, right? Where we can recognize like all bodies are inherently worthy, and we celebrate the differences in each of us, and we're not afraid of that. We don't run away from that. That's a good thing, you know?
Exactly. Exactly. Absolutely. We all have so much to bring to this world, and we I get really fired up and really passionate about this. We all have this inherent worthiness within us. We are born with it, and I think it's society that kind of almost beats that out of us, and tells us that we're not. And that's a really sad thing, and it's something that makes me really quite angry and really quite upset. And when we look back on it, I think, as I said, we all have so much to bring to this world. And when we start to, I guess, look at our qualities and our attributes and what we can bring and what we can offer, that's amazing. When we come together as a collective of people and we come together to share ideas and share passions, and to be able to have brave conversations where we may not necessarily agree with each other, and that's absolutely okay, but to have space for that, and to have space for understanding, and space for conversations that don't shut people down or make people feel less than or shame people or judge people. I mean, I may be thinking of an ideal kind of utopia here, but
That's all right. We're dreaming.
it's just my vision for the world. I could go on forever, but yeah, I just, I feel really passionately about it, and I think, it's where we need to go. It's really where we need to go in this world.
Well, I agree. And I'm so grateful to have, somewhat of a platform to be able to learn more myself, and then also share these conversations with people in the hopes that, little by little things can shift in individuals, who can help shift families, who can help shift communities, and onward from there. I have that same vision. And wouldn't the world be such a beautiful place if it wasn't this whole fat phobia thing didn't exist?
Oh, Yeah, absolutely. I've just gone goosebumpy as, or I think for do you say goosebumps or
Oh yeah.
goose pimples?
No,
Yeah,
we say
yeah, yeah.
goosebumps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, just checking. I was thinking that might have just been an Australian thing, but
Oh
yeah, I've just
no,
gone
I know.
goosebumpy as you were saying that. Um, yeah, I just I don't even have the words. I think it's just it's such a really beautiful thing if we can start to embrace diversity and if we can start to celebrate that and if we can start to see it as something that is really helpful and really beautiful rather than something that is scary or something that is absolutely terrifying to us.
Yeah.
I just think that we can be doing so much more in this space in terms of diversity and inclusivity for all people.
So that is what we want to talk about today. And I had a question pop into my mind, and I kind of want to go with it because I feel like it might help us get there.
Mm.
So I we're going to be talking about privilege today, and I'm so excited to hear your thoughts on this and to explore this with you. I recognize that I am the embodiment of a lot of privilege. I am, and I recognize that when people see me, because I'm clued into what goes on for people, lots of different types of people, just because I do this work and I sit with people and listen for a living. I'm clued into this enough to recognize the body language and the way I'm treated when I show up in spaces of with diverse bodies. I can tell that people look at me and assume that I am going to treat them badly. And I don't blame
Mm.
anybody for that. I know where that comes from. But I wonder, Nicole, is there something a privileged person, and again, we're going to be talking more about what that means in context of eating disorders and body image and body size and all of that. But I'm wondering if it just makes me sad when I want to put a sign on my like forehead that says I'm safe, like I'm not gonna
Mm.
do that to you. But I totally get where someone might be coming from, taking one look at me and assuming like, oh, she'll just be like other, you know, 5'6" blonde women I've met before or something, you know?
Yeah, yeah. It's look, I think it's a really tricky thing, and I think these conversations around privilege are actually really hard to have. These conversations around privilege are difficult and they are tricky and they are uncomfortable, and there's no, I guess there's no way around that. Um, I mean, I guess I need to declare the privilege that I also have, too. Even though I exist in a larger body, I am, kind of on the smaller end of being in a larger body. I'm a white woman. I'm an educated woman. I'm relatively stable in terms of, job and finances and such. So, I mean, I exist with a lot of privilege too, but I think for people that exist in the margins, that idea that people will automatically judge them or automatically, let me flip that around for a second. I think that for a lot of people that exist in the margins, that idea that they need to always be on the defensive is something that you go into the world with.
Yes, that's
It's
so
something
important to
that,
understand. Like you approach every
yeah,
situation on edge because of the
yes.
trauma you've endured around whatever marginalization you've experienced, right?
That's exactly right. Thank you so much for articulating what I was trying to say then. That's exactly right. When we think about fat phobia in particular, and when we think about size discrimination, that is trauma. That is absolutely trauma. And when you have experienced so much trauma in the world solely because of the body that you inhabit, you go into every single situation with a trauma response. You go into every single social situation, you go into every single, you know, situation in terms of going for a job, in terms of being in a public space, in terms of sitting in a doctor's waiting room, in terms of, sitting down on a chair in a waiting room and wondering whether that chair is actually going to collapse underneath you. You go into every single space with a trauma response. So you are so heightened every time. And when you're faced with situations where you may be interacting with people that have an incredible amount of body privilege, and we don't know this. We don't know privilege just by looking at people. Well, okay, let me backtrack for a second. We know body privilege by looking at people. I guess,
Right.
we can tell that, people in smaller bodies have an incredible amount of privilege in the world solely because of the body that they inhabit. And that's no fault of anybody's. That's just, it is what it is. It's because of the social construct of our society, right? So, when we're interacting, when people in larger bodies are interacting with people in privileged bodies, that can actually be a real disconnect in the room, particularly in a clinical setting, particularly in a doctor's office, particularly in a social setting, whatever that might be, because, for somebody in a larger body, you're actually going in there with that trauma response and you're expecting somebody to judge you, you're expecting somebody to shame you, you're expecting to receive, diet and weight loss advice, etc., whatever that might be. And so I think for particularly if I can kind of jump into clinicians and working in a clinical space, I think what clinicians can do is really be curious about what it's like to sit in the room, what it's like for our bodies to sit in this room together, explore that with people, talk about that, open that dialogue up. What is it like to sit here? What is it like for me to sit here in my body? What is it like for you to sit here in your body? What does that mean about our bodies in the room together? It's such an important conversation because I think there's so much that's left unsaid when we don't have these conversations about bodies and we don't have these conversations around what that means in terms of a therapeutic relationship or et cetera, et cetera. I guess if I can sum that up, because I feel like I've been rambling, like just that idea of we need to be talking about bodies. We
Yeah.
need to be talking about bodies in ways that, you know, are, I guess, exploring what bodies are like. It's bodies are bodies, and I don't understand why we categorize bodies in such ways. And it's these are just such important conversations to have.
I love that idea of just opening up the dialogue, whether that's, in a therapeutic setting or in a medical setting or with a close friend, just kind of saying, hey, like, um, what's this like for you right now? What's this like for me? What are
Yeah.
you experiencing? Because I think so often what feels so profound and powerful about that is that I think it's just so normal for us to go through the world stressing about our bodies that maybe we don't even recognize how abnormal that actually is. Like we're so used to it that we
Mm.
don't even question it. It's just like going in circles and loops in your brain all day long. And for someone to just say, "Hey, like let's call this what it is and talk about it." I feel like that could really have the potential to get some of that just subconscious looping kind of out of there, where then you can actually, build a relationship or work on therapeutic things or actually have a conversation about your medical standpoint or whatever. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I just wanted to add to that as well, and I think that we'll obviously dive much deeper into this as we kind of talk more about privilege, but we all have our own body stories, right? We all have our own experiences of our bodies and they are unique to us. We each experience our own bodies in a different way, and some of that may be shared experience amongst people who may live in the margins or whatever that might be. But our own body stories are unique to us. And when we talk about privilege, and I guess this is a really lovely preface into the conversation that we're about to dive into. I guess when we talk about privilege, and particularly when we talk about thin privilege, it's not discounting the fact that somebody may feel uncomfortable in their body, or that may have an experience of their body that is not a favorable experience. It's not discounting, and it's not discrediting the pain and the suffering that comes with that. It's basically, well, it's not basically, it's saying that people in smaller bodies don't experience the systemic trauma and the systemic oppression that those in larger bodies face because of the body that they inhabit, just because of the body that somebody lives in, that automatically gives them privilege. And that I guess privilege can kind of be a really polarizing thing for people to talk about. And I think that's why I kind of said earlier that it's a really difficult thing to discuss, and it's a really uncomfortable thing to discuss. But, I just wanted to make that point of, nobody's pain and nobody's suffering of living in their body is discredited or discounted in any way, shape, or form.
Or unimportant, right?
Yes.
It matters whether you are in a small body or a large body, whatever. Your pain matters. Maria Paredes, who's been on the podcast, posted something recently on social media where she was saying, like, don't confuse my criticism for Weight Watchers changing their name to WW. Don't confuse that as me saying that you're bad if you have or are currently participating in their program. There's a difference between condemning basically the abuser, but still loving the person who's getting abused. I mean, I'm botching, but that's sort of the idea here, right? Where it's like, we're not saying that individual pain doesn't matter. It's saying there's this whole other dimension that maybe you've never even considered.
Yes.
If you haven't had the experience of being in a marginalized body, whether that's, there's so many different aspects of privilege, right? We're talking right now about body size as a form of privilege, but there's also obviously like socioeconomic status, class, race, gender, sexuality, so many other elements to this idea of privilege too.
Absolutely. And, I think in saying that too, particularly when we talk more about, eating disorder and eating disorder recovery, that in itself is a social justice issue. And I think that's what, that's exactly what I meant earlier when I said that, I think I said, that bodies are inherently political. And diet culture in itself is political. It's product of, classism, racism, sexism, transphobia, et cetera, et cetera. It's bringing together, well, it's not bringing together, it's highlighting, all of these injustices in the world that, there's a common thread, and we can't, I guess we can't look at and we can't examine things just through one lens. We have to look at them through a number of lenses. And I think it's exactly the same when we talk about bodies. It's political, really.
Right.
When it comes down to it.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree, and that can be a stretch for some people to think about if you haven't thought about it that way. If this is what she's saying, kind of blowing your mind a little, like sit with that, because I totally agree that bodies are political inherently, and therefore this whole conversation we're trying to have today is, that's part of what makes it so tricky, is just the political nature of talking about bodies, which it's like, it shouldn't be, right? It shouldn't be so hard. That's the whole point though, right? That's the whole point.
Yes, that is it. That's the whole point. It shouldn't be so hard, but it is, because it's so tied into so many oppressive social constructs.
Right. That's exactly the crux of this, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. And these are the huge oppressive social constructs that we are trying, I guess, in the activist space so hard to challenge and to chip away at, and to create ripples, and to whatever other cheesy metaphor you'd like to add to that.
I don't think it's cheesy. I like it. I like the ripple effect metaphor a lot.
I work a lot in metaphors, and sometimes people roll their eyes at me. So,
Oh no, I dig
um,
it. You can do it as much of that as you want. So Nicole, let's talk a little bit about um, where as someone who is very much in the activist space and also someone who's a trained um, social worker and someone who is working actively clinically, what are some kind of broad brushstrokes ideas of like where you feel like people things could be better for the people we serve if we were more actively looking at our privilege?
yeah, look, I think that this is such a broad topic, and I could probably talk to you for days about this page. It's just it's one of those topics
It's a
that
lot,
once
I
I get
know.
started, it's look, I think we need to. I mean, there's a number of levels and there's a number of different nuances in this. And I think this is what I really love about what you've been doing in terms of nuance matters, right? It's one of those things that is is tricky, but I think if we can kind of look at it on a more global level for a moment, I think our eating disorder organizations, where in whatever country that may be, here in Australia, in the States, in Canada, wherever else you may be listening from, I think that as national organizations, we can start there. It's about examining privilege within those organizations too. It's about looking at, okay, what are the social constructs that exist in these organizations? What kind of fat phobia and what kind of oppression is actually occurring within these organizations? And I mean, some examples of that I can think of as, I know that and a number of different eating disorder organizations have done this in the past is, when they're aligning with quote unquote body positive clothing companies that only cater for certain sizes. It's excluding an entire population of people with eating disorders from actually being a part of that campaign or being a part of that message or whatever that may be. And I think that is such an example of where we can look at privilege. Who is it that's actually looking at those campaigns? Where are those conversations happening? Have they actually consulted with people in larger bodies? Have they actually consulted with people who I mean, ultimately are going to be affected by this message? Have they actually thought about the impact of these campaigns? Have they actually thought about how this is going to land for all bodies and not just some bodies?
Do you feel
This
like
is,
part of the complexity here is I'm not like a eating disorder historian, but kind of from my very maybe
mm,
uneducated perspective on the history of eating disorder organizations, just my
mm,
general sense is, I mean, eating disorders, we haven't been even talking about them for very long. If we really take a step
no,
back, like it's a very new thing that we are trying to address. And definitely like at least in the States, the 80s were sort of, when the conversation seemed to start and where there were certain people who embodied, certain diagnoses that people then would say, oh, that's what an eating disorder is. And then as time went
mm,
on, there's been more and more push to remember that eating disorders don't have a look and that, you
mm,
can't look at someone and know what they might be going through with food or in that realm. I kind of see
yeah,
it as like a growing pain thing where I think it just seems like just in the last little bit, eating disorder organizations are finally saying, oh yeah, like there's this whole like element of like body size that maybe we've been excluding even just in our research, in our rhetoric, and our conferences, where we thought of eating disorders as existing in this smaller body, and now the conversation has been opened up to no, wait a minute, let's talk about, all the different ways that eating disorders can look and be and feel and exist in different humans. What would you add to
yeah.
that though?
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with you. I think that the conversation has changed. And I mean, what I'm about to say may be a little bit polarizing, and I mean, people can agree or disagree with me, but I still think that there is such a way to go for a number of our organizations, and that is across the board, it's across the world. I think it's an issue everywhere, not just here in Australia, but everywhere that I see. These conversations are definitely being had, and certainly the messaging around, eating disorders affecting any person in any body, and eating disorders not particularly having one look, etc., etc. What I'm not seeing, though, is this being followed up with action. And what I'm not seeing is this being followed up with inclusive marketing campaigns or
Okay, that's
inclusive
important.
fundraising campaigns or inclusive messaging in fact sheets or inclusive language on websites or visibility of different bodies on websites or so we're having the conversation, so we're talking the talk, but we're not walking the
Mm.
walk. And this is where privilege, I guess, comes into it. This is where, we may have we may have people of privilege in high positions in these organizations across the board that are making decisions for and about all people in all bodies without necessarily consulting with those people that exist in marginalized bodies, without necessarily opening those conversations about bodies, without examining their own inherent biases, without looking at how fat phobia affects all people. And this is so important when we talk about privilege. Just because something doesn't affect you doesn't mean that it's not happening.
Mm.
And this is where we can be doing so much better, I think, on a global level. And this is where it kind of, I guess that was a lovely little segue as to how this kind of filters down into more of an individual level too, and what we can all be doing, personally and professionally in our spaces too.
Well, I want to get there, but I also want to mention something. I've been following you very closely over the past few months, ever since we set the date to have our podcast, and obviously before then too. But I just need to say right here, right now, your YouTube video that I watched of you reading this incredibly heartfelt, kind, compassionate, but also very strong letter you wrote, kind of saying it basically, it's just started with dear eating disorder providers, and you hit on so much of what my clients sit in my office and tell me through tears in their eyes, like how it
Mm,
feels to interact with the medical system or with eating disorder treatment or whatever, in a larger body, and how things can improve. I was so touched by that. I just need to say that, and I also want to really point people listening to take some time to listen to that YouTube video or watch it, obviously, because it was incredibly well done. And I just admire your courage. I know that couldn't have been easy to do. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
yeah, sure. I mean, thank you so much. Again, I just got goosebumps as you were talking about it. It that was actually an open letter that I had delivered at the Australia New Zealand Academy for Eating Disorders conference back in August in Melbourne, Australia, and I got up in front of 450 eating disorder providers and I read that letter out to them. And I did it through shaking hands, I did it through tears, I did it through anger, I did it through compassion, and it was one of those moments where I, as a person in a larger body and as somebody who sat back at, I mean, the 2017 Eating Disorders Conference and felt like I had absolutely zero place there because we were so focused around, making people in larger bodies smaller through, putting people with eating disorders on diets. That's a whole different story. But
That's a
for
whole.
this, yeah, that's a whole other rabbit hole. But for this conference, it was so centered around the voice of the lived experience, and it was so centered around hearing marginalized voices, and it was just so incredibly well put together. and thoughtfully put together, and to have that opportunity to stand up on stage and actually kind of no holds barred on being able to say what needed to be said to a group of eating disorder providers. And it was one of those moments where I felt I'm starting to get emotional talking about it, but it was one of those moments where I actually felt heard, and I actually felt like, people in the room got it and was starting to think about it and was starting to understand in some small way what it's actually like for somebody who shows up in your clinic room, who shows up in your space, that, has all of this trauma and all of this fear and all of this, I guess, all of these experiences of existing in a body that, people so often tell you that's wrong, that you're so often shamed or discriminated against. So to be able to write this open letter to the eating disorder community was incredibly terrifying and incredibly liberating at the same time. And there were a number of people after the conference that came up to me and asked, was this recorded? This could be such a great training resource for my team back home. And, that's kind of what inspired me to go into the studio the next morning and record it. So what you'll see on the YouTube video is an incredibly, I guess, calm reading of the letter.
A little different than the live version.
Little different than the live version. Less tears. But yeah, I think it's such a great resource. And I do need to preface that with that it's just my story and it's just my experience. But it rings true for so many others that don't necessarily feel as though their voice is heard as well. So I just want people to know that it's just my experience and I'm not speaking for everybody. But it's something that a lot of people can relate to.
Absolutely. And I just want to add, I feel like you gave those 450 people and beyond with the YouTube video, you have given us such a gift with that. But I also want to say, I'm just so proud of those 450 people. I'm sure there were, dissenters among, statistically there were, of course there were, but
of course,
but just they gave you such a gift too. This ability to show up as your authentic self, unapologetically, reading this very challenging thing for them probably to hear, but to respond to you with understanding and with kindness and with grace and with the ability to look at their own stuff. What a gift they gave you,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had, of course, as you say, there were people that the message may not have landed for, and that was absolutely okay. I had to know that walking in there. I knew that it wasn't going to land for everybody, but I looked down at the end of actually delivering that to the room of 450 people, and the majority of people were on their feet on a in a standing ovation, crying their eyes out. And to know that hit so many people in such a way and had such an impact in such a way, I had hoped that walking away from that moment that, it may have sparked just a small spark, in terms of people actually looking at their own stuff and looking at the way that they can unpack their own privilege and the way that they can start to change the narrative of eating disorder recovery in their own practice. I still don't have words for it. I still don't have words for the experience. I've been trying for months and I just can't get there.
I think also just how liberating for the clinician to recognize that you don't have to opt into diet culture just because you're working with someone in a larger body, right? Just to recognize that's not the answer, and there's alternatives that are way more health promoting. I just feel like sometimes people don't know that, don't recognize that this thing called a diet that we're using to try to solve someone's eating disorder of a person who's in a larger body, like that does not cure or treat the eating disorder, you know?
Not at all. If anything, it fuels it.
Of course. Yes.
I guess it's a great kind of business model, if I can say that, like it keeps somebody coming back. But
Oh, that's a scary thought, but
sorry,
yes.
that was a little bit cynical, but I mean, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. It's when, I mean, fat phobia breeds eating disorders, right? It breeds eating disorders, and that's a really scary, sad thought. Um, yeah, it's. Oh, yeah, I've
No
gotten
words.
all kind of, yeah, no
No
words.
words.
Like I'm just kind of filled with rage right now. Yeah, it breeds eating disorders, and that it makes me incredibly, incredibly sad.
Well, I think things are progressing. Think about 2017 when you were in that same conference and how you felt,
Mm,
and then just to see what a year did, both internally with you, but also more broadly with those people, and then like globally, the conversation has changed in the last year. I think it has.
yeah, yeah, I definitely think it has. I definitely think it has. The conversation is changing. And I mean that's a really great start. And I'm really lucky to be a part of that, and I'm really glad to have been, perhaps a catalyst for change in that. But I still, there's still such a part of me that, you know, wants to see more. It's one, as I said, it's one thing to be having these conversations, but we really need to follow this up with action.
So let's
We
talk about
can't
that,
just,
Nicole, because you were saying before,
yeah,
you're saying let's talk about the implications of looking at privilege, more maybe more broadly in eating disorder communities or treatment modalities or even organizations, but also what about individually? What are your ideas about that?
yeah, look, I think that in terms of privilege, we really need to be looking at the ways in which our privilege shows up in the work that we do. The ways in which our privilege shows up in the assumptions that we make, the way that our privilege shows up in the way that we respond to people, the way that we understand a person's experience, or the way that we can't possibly understand a person's experience because of the privilege that we have. The way in which we really need to start to unpack our own bias that we have towards certain bodies, or just, I guess, the beliefs that we have, and where those beliefs have come from. And I'm in no way saying that this is an easy process. This is a lifelong process for all of us. And I think that, myself, I'm still on this path of unpacking a lot of my own stuff. And I'm sure that there are so many other clinicians out there as well that are continuously learning and continuously unpacking. But I think that this is part of it. If your privilege gets in the way of you, how do I put this? I guess if your privilege gets in the way of you actually wanting to know more, if you're standing on your privilege going, nope, I know everything, I'm an
Mm.
educated person, I'm an expert in this field, etc., that's standing in your privilege. What I'm wanting to see is people going, okay, yes, okay, I've worked in this field for 20 odd years, but I still have so much more to learn. This is a process of learning for all of us. This is a process of continuously unpacking the beliefs that we have. This is a process of continually critically evaluating everything that we see out there in this world. This is a process of questioning. It's a process of, calling things in when we see it. It's a process of allyship. Privilege can be used. I guess I've kind of painted privilege in a way of perhaps being something that is inherently bad in a way, and I don't want to do that. And I think that privilege can be used in such a way that is really actually powerful. And when we're talking about, I guess, kind of eating disorder clinicians, and when we're talking about people in this space of being able to dismantle the oppressive social construct of fat phobia, people with privilege actually have power. People with privilege in this space can be such allies. And I think it's really important for people with privilege in this space to be allies. Everybody can call this out when they see it. When you see something fat phobic in a magazine or on television or on social media or, on the radio or whatever, call it out. Write in, make a comment on social media. This is where people with privilege have power. This is where you can actually be an ally to those in marginalized bodies and say, actually, this is not okay. This is a step towards dismantling those social constructs and actually being able to go, actually, I am not okay with this either. Even though I exist in a body with privilege, I am not okay with people continuing to further oppress and further marginalize those who don't have the same privilege as I do.
Yeah, that's so important. And so what I'm hearing you say is you were saying like privilege isn't inherently wrong or bad. It's just something to
No.
recognize that when you have it or when you recognize that you don't have it, it can help make things make sense. Like, oh, that's why when my friend in a larger body has told me their experience, I just kind of like brush them off because that's not my experience. But maybe I need to listen.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I talk a lot about respectful curiosity, and it's one of those things where, we don't know what we don't know, right? We don't know what we don't know, and we can't see what we can't see, and we don't understand what we don't understand. It's one of those, it seems quite a simple concept, but it's not. And we we can only learn by observing, by asking, by listening, by doing research, by learning and taking the opportunity to ask questions. And, it's it's really one of those situations where you can be curious about another person's experience, but they don't, particularly if a person is in a marginalized body, they don't owe you the, I guess, the emotional labor, or they don't owe you the education of actually, I guess, providing that for you. That's something that, I guess, privilege can come into play. There are a lot of people with privilege out there that expect people in marginalized bodies to provide that free emotional labor and that free education of what it's like to exist in a marginalized body. And this is where respectful curiosity can come into it. You can ask people, particularly friends, family members, your clients, what it's like to actually exist in their body, what it is like for them to experience their own body.
But Nicole,
What I
what's the line? So for someone who's listening who's like, okay, I really, really want to work on this and I want to
Yeah.
do better. What's the line between asking questions and being supportive and really trying to understand and then further kind of putting the oppressed person in a position where they feel like because they are oppressed, they automatically like owe this to them, or kind of feel like,
Yeah.
oh, when we rank ourselves, I'm below you, so I'll just do whatever you ask me to do, even if it makes me uncomfortable, or if I don't want to, or if I don't have the energy right now. What do you think that balance is?
Yeah, look, I think this looks different for everybody, to be honest. I think this looks different for a lot of people who exist in marginalized bodies. Um, uh, I think, uh, look, I kind of see this. I kind of see this in a couple of ways, and when we are curious about somebody's experience, I think friends, family members, clinicians, etc., we can have those conversations with people. We can simply say, what is it like to exist in your body? What is your experience of your body? And we can seek to understand that in a really respectful and compassionate and understanding and non-judgmental way. And we can ask questions about that. But knowing that, I guess, the person that you're talking to that may exist in a marginalized body is okay to say, I don't want to have this conversation.
Right.
You know, this is not up to me to be able to talk to you about this. It's knowing that that's okay for a person to opt out of that conversation. I
And then
think if we kind of,
you as the privileged person need to try to maybe recognize when you want to swoop in and provide advice and really just check
yes,
that and try to just listen and ask questions and validate and reflectively listen instead, right? Because I think when you're coming from
yeah,
a place of privilege, you're used to being like, all right, my voice needs to be heard, and just
yes,
making sure you're not
yes.
doing that. And I recognize that as I'm saying this, I kind of interrupted you, and I didn't I don't mean that to be an example of what I'm saying to try to avoid, but anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's exactly right. And I think that when we, particularly when we talk about privilege, I think if I can kind of use this as an example, as in a body positive space, right? And I have all sorts of issues with body positivity because I think that it's become such a diluted and watered down concept, and it's really detracted from what it was meant to be. I think that there are a lot of people with privilege who are being elevated in the body positive space, and I think that that's a problem. And what you were just saying then about knowing when to step aside and knowing when your voice isn't as important is in a space as somebody who is marginalized. It's really about raising and elevating those marginalized voices. It's knowing when to step aside and knowing when your voice is actually helpful or when it will be further oppressing or further marginalizing people whose voices actually need to be heard in a space the most. And
That's
I can see
huge.
this yeah, yeah, and I can see this happening a lot in body positive spaces. There was an example recently where a certain social media person had released a social media post that basically had said it was a picture of a woman in a bikini, and she was thin, she was white, she was cisgendered, she has a huge social media platform as well. And this particular social media person had said that the person in the photo was the epitome of body positivity, and I had a real issue with that. And when we, I guess, when we put privilege up on a pedestal, it really dilutes the idea that any sort of diversity in this space can exist. Um, and that's problematic. That silences and that further oppresses those voices that body positivity was made for, that body positivity, actually needs. So this is where privilege, I guess, is being used in a really harmful way and a really oppressive way, and a way in which to silence voices that really, really do need to be heard in this space the most.
So
Um,
everything you're saying, I just want to point out, like knowing when to step aside and being skilled enough to recognize your own privilege and to elevate others' voices and to do this in, a very sensitive. This is such a sensitive topic, right? So emotions
mm,
are huge around these issues. I just want to point out, like, you are going to make mistakes, like you are
yes.
going to do something with certain intentions that feel really good and wholesome to you, and then you're going to realize either someone points it out to you, or through more learning and growing you look back at something you did and you're like, whew, that wasn't the right thing.
Mm,
But I just want to say, like, that's okay. Like, no one expects
yes.
everyone to, like, have all of this stuff figured out. I'm the first to admit that, like, doing this podcast has changed me and helped me grow. Doing this work that I do has, I would hope that I've improved, and I feel like I have, and I feel
Mm,
like I've learned.
mm,
And so I just want to point out that, this is complex. This is, emotional. This is tricky. This is systemic. This is all the things. And so don't ever for 1 minute expect perfection, and do for every minute expect that, especially if you're coming from a place of privilege, you're going to have people who lovingly, or maybe even more angrily, point out, hey, this was hard and here's why, or here is something you could do better. And I think that that's part of what I wanted to say in this conversation is like, that's healthy, that's good, that's to be expected.
Yes.
Who possibly could have all this stuff figured out? Yeah. So what do you want to add to that though?
I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. I think that was something that I was really wanting to lead into as well. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. This is tricky, and it is nuanced, and it is such a it's a tangled web. It's messy. And I think we really need to be willing to rumble with that messiness and sit in that uncertainty of, we're not going to get this right. I still make mistakes. I still get called in by people, and that's okay. That's where those learning opportunities come from. That's where we can all learn and we can all grow. And I think that there is such a way where we can call people in. And I'm really glad that you pointed out that, we can call people in compassionately. And there are times in which, people in marginalized bodies may actually get really angry and may actually be like, actually, no, this is not okay. This is hurtful. This is harmful. And it may come across as anger. And I really want to say that as a person that exists in a marginalized body, getting angry about this stuff is actually really okay. If you exist in a marginalized body and you see something that is hurtful and that is harmful, anger is an absolutely okay response to have. And when people ask for niceness, that is a way of them further oppressing or further marginalizing those of us that exist in the margins. If I can flip back to, I guess, the fact that we are all learning and we are all going to make mistakes. Mistakes are really, they're a given, and they're really powerful learning opportunities. And I think that when we can learn to embrace the mistakes that we make, and we can learn from those and we can grow from those, and realize that it's not a reflection of who we are as people when we make mistakes. We're all human. We're all going to make them. But it's what we do with that. It's what we do with those opportunities moving forwards that really matters.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just think that we get so caught up in thinking that admitting that we've made a mistake or having something being pointed out to us means that we're a bad person, or it's like some deeper core belief we need to look at there, because it's like when we really examine it, you're like, well, of course I would make mistakes. Like, look how complicated this is. And at least I'm trying, like it's good. And it's good that I'm progressing and learning. That's the attitude I try to have. I know I'm imperfect with that too, but just the attitude of just like, yeah, this is complicated. Of course I'll make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that that's really important, as clinicians working in this space, that we don't have to have it all figured out. And I think that that's a really important kind of role modeling tool for the clients that we're working with as well. If we go into sessions, or if we go into the work that we do thinking that we have to have it all figured out, how is that going to translate for a client? I mean, if we can have that common humanity and that common understanding that we're all going to make mistakes and we're all going to trip and we're all going to fall, but that's okay. I think that there's power in being able to role model that for our clients as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, just the imperfect and the messiness and the nuance of what we're asking our clients to do. I really believe strongly, like we need to show them that's okay by how we interact and how we, fight for the things that are important to us, but admit our faults and are imperfect and messy humans ourselves,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so often we are asking our clients to be brave and be courageous and to embrace parts of themselves that may feel uncomfortable. And I think this relates so much to being able to call out. I guess from a clinical perspective, this relates so much to being able to call out the fat phobia that we see, particularly in eating disorder treatment. That takes courage. It takes bravery. It takes heart to be able to do that. And I think if we're expecting our clients to do that, then the least that we can do is to be able to do that ourselves as well.
Oh, so true. But that requires a lot of work, doesn't it? Like
It
a
does.
lot of personal
It does.
work. Yeah.
It does. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Nicole, this has been such a delight. I can't believe we're already pretty much to the end of our time, but I wanted to give you a minute to just is there anything we didn't hit on that you wanted to, or is there anything you feel like you need to clarify or summarize, or what would you say kind of in closing?
Oh gosh. I mean, I could talk to you for hours. It's just I can't
Let's
believe
do
it's
it
gone so
sometime.
quickly. I know. I feel like we need to just have a few hour long Zoom conversation with a glass of wine. The time difference might be a bit hard, but
A glass of wine
um,
for me would be like coffee for you in the morning.
yeah, yeah, totally. Look, I think if I can summarize that, this is a really complicated and a really nuanced area. We are all going to make mistakes. Intention versus impact is something that is so important, and we constantly have to be aware of it. I think we're talking the talk, but we need to be walking the walk.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
we need to be doing that more.
First, on
We
on
need
an
to the
individual
conversations are
level,
happening.
but on an organizational level too.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. We need to be taking action. The conversations are happening and they're starting, and that's great, but we need to be seeing action. And I think, in closing as well, just calling out what you see and critically evaluating, all of the diet culture rubbish that we see in our world, and calling it out when you see it. When we are silent in the face of oppression, we're giving it permission to thrive, and that's not okay with me. And I really want to throw that open. You can be an active agent in the oppression of others by staying silent, or you can be an active agent of change, and that choice is up to you.
Mm, such an incredible summary. I've loved this conversation. This has been so amazing. I don't even know I have no words now. Um, will you just take a minute, Nicole, and talk about how people can find you, follow along with your work, all of that stuff?
Yeah, sure. I guess I am most active on Instagram. That is my home. I pretty much most of my Instagram content goes to Facebook and to Twitter anyway. So if you find me on Instagram at the embodied journey, all one word, all lowercase, that's where I kind of spend most of my time. I've been a bit quiet on there recently. I just kind of needed to take some time to chill for myself, but yeah, there's lots of rants about weight stigma. There's lots of pushback about diet culture. Lots of stuff about fat phobia, and yeah, really about I guess kind of topical stuff that may come up that I respond to at the time as well. So feel free to reach out. Feel free to follow, contact. Yeah, get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. This has been such a privilege, if I dare use that word. No, I'm just kidding. No, but really,
You can
this
use
has been such
it.
a privilege to talk with you. Thank you for being here. You are a lovely human doing incredible work, and I'm just grateful to know you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been such an honor to come on and to have this chat. And, thank you for all the work that you do as well. It's just incredible to be a part of such an amazing community from all across the world.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.